This week, we share interviews from Black Hat. In the news segment, we look at Vulns in old code and a new protocol. Another tool shines for Kubernetes. Picture yourself scaling static analysis and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. False positives suck. With so many mobile apps to test, how much time will you waste on false positives? Eliminate them today with NowSecure. Only NowSecure automates static, dynamic, and interactive testing on real Android and iOS devices. Now you get speed, accuracy, and efficiency for DevOps, plus the broadest coverage of security, compliance, and privacy issues. Why waste time on false positives? Visit securityweekly.com/NowSecure to learn how to scale your mobile AppSec testing with NowSecure. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 73, recorded August 19th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I am here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Good morning. 2 weeks in a row without John. At least he's feeling better.
Yes, we miss you, John. Come back. We have a lot more. I had a whole open containers pun all prepared for him, but we're just going to have to hope he recovers soon and feels better. We also have exciting news about the Security Weekly webcast program. We are now partnered with ISC Squared as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will be receiving 1 CPE credit per webcast. Register for one of our upcoming webcasts with Zane Lackey of Signal Sciences, or Ian McShane from Endgame, or both, by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th through 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a $100 discount to attend the 2-day conference. Use discount code HH19SW when you register, or go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted and register there. Make sure you check out the keynote, Paul Asadorian, and Mr. Jeff Mann's talk as well. So we got through a lot. We had to catch up last week on 2 weeks worth of news there, Matt, and the prior week just now hasn't been quiet either. So 2 cool things, or big things, kind of stood out to me were, one, if we go back into Windows. So Google Project Zero has been busy. They were busy before Black Hat, poking around at iOS. They've been busy during and after, since poking around at Windows in an auspiciously named component called CTF. But what this really, and so it boils down to a local privilege escalation capability in a component that is that basically handles messaging between windows, like RPCs essentially. But what stood out to me is that here is something that kind of highlights 2 or 3 questions. So at what point do you stop threat modeling different components because maybe the code actually isn't changing that much? Or what point do you revisit those threat models when your architecture for a Windows operating system has changed in 10, 20 years, and this fundamental core component hasn't really been re-reviewed or revisited or re-understood?
Yeah, I think it's the latter part, right? We have a lot of old legacy components still embedded in these operating systems. And so the question is, why is this still there? Or why didn't they update it? Or why haven't we found this before? Because this thing's been there for 15 plus years.
Yeah, that's what's wild. It's both that aspect of this balance that Windows has to, or at least wants to, maintain a long backwards compatibility, but also just the effort to re-architecture, complex operating systems like this is a pretty tough undertaking. You can't just do that with, why break something that's fixed, in the sense of changing components. Whereas in this case, there's actually a component that actually has been broken for a long time. And all it takes is someone to start paying attention to it and uncovering those dusty bits. And I think yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly right. It's all this stuff that nobody's paid attention to in 15 plus years because it's been there forever, and now people are like, wait a minute, I wonder what this does. Oh yeah, there's a vulnerability in there that no one's thought about before. So it creates a very interesting risk profile and threat assessment that I think legacy systems have a challenge with. Is we've think about what Microsoft has done over the years with this operating system and continue to expand capabilities, but then you have this backwards old stuff sitting there and probably totally forgotten about it in some respects because it just worked.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a very strong, I think a very good parallel we can bring to any, web-based architecture, especially how we've been talking about doing that DevOps migration to a cloud. You're going to have some sort of hybrid architecture for a bit. You're going to have some, messy migration before you are fully cloud native. And it's during that time that you'll be either introducing vulnerabilities or you'll be uncovering components that have had vulnerabilities for a long time. Or even in the worst case, you're just going to be lifting and dropping those old components into the cloud, into a container. And now you've brought a vulnerability into your AWS or your GCP environment, because you never even bothered to review that old component.
Right. And this component's really interesting because of privilege escalation to get to root. Think about that running in a container where you now have access to the underlying Kubernetes or orchestration system because you've escalated privileges in the container.
Absolutely. And what was interesting too, so we had this, here was some, old code. Somebody decided to go poke around this component, but we still are building, we as the information security community are still building new protocols. So HTTP 2.0 had a slew of about 7 vulns that were found between accredited to engineer from Netflix and engineer from Google, who are part of the Envoy security team. So a couple things there, just as sort of the meta conversation. Just last week, we were telling people upgrade to your servers, your web servers, to HTTP 2.0 to avoid a bunch of prior vulnerabilities that we'd seen. This request smuggling and HTTP desync attack that Portswinger was talking about at Black Hat. And we've also been talking about Envoy as a way to build out a service mesh for your new modern, whether it's cloud native or just your modern app infrastructure, microservices. But here now we have some people poking against this protocol saying, you know what, we're probably reinventing a lot of the problems that we saw in the HTTP 1.0 and 1.1 protocols as well.
Yeah, you're right. We were just talking about this last week, right? Bunch of vulnerabilities in HTTP 1.1. We said, 2.0 fixes this. So now a slew of these come out. So this is the most interesting part of the article. In most cases, an immediate workaround is to disable HTTP/2 support. Great. So now we're back to 1.1.
I did have to groan at that one. I was like, no, please don't do that. Just because in this case, to put things in a little bit of perspective, these are primarily denial of service and resource exhaustion types of vulnerabilities. So they're going to hit of your old CIA triad, they're going to hit your availability. So it's at the moment, there's no RCE in here. There's no leaking memory like our old good friend Heartbleed or something like that. But it is kind of neat because even if you go back to 1.0, HTTP 1.0, you're still possibly going to be exposed to slow LoRa's attacks, other types of attacks that are keeping open these, basically opening up a lot of connections and then just slowly dribbling out bytes over that connection to keep them open, and do what are typically called like these asynchronous denial of service attacks, where the attacker just has to do a little bit of work and the server side has to do a lot of work or has to take up a lot of resources, which just makes it a lot easier for an attacker with, a few laptops or a few Amazon or, whatever cloud instances can pull off a more effective DOS. So nothing earth-shattering. Please keep your HTTP 2.0 servers turned on and just patch them, update them, do some configuration tweaks and move on to more interesting things.
Yeah, there might be some mitigating controls either through your existing DDoS protections or potentially the WAF. Maybe
Yeah.
it would be interesting. I didn't dig into all these, but I know some of them were ping floods and some other things that you might have mitigating controls for, so you don't have to like completely turn it off if you have some of those other mitigating technologies in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Some of these should actually be pretty detectable from the network, and especially where a WAF is going to live, and also pretty easy to address, I would guess, in the sense of mitigating against single source traffic coming from single IP addresses.
Yeah.
This did take me. There were two things I wanted to throw out. Again, speaking of a reminder, back to I think it was episode 71. We were talking about SSH certificate authorities.
Yep.
And
ephemeral
ephemeral.
certificates.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly. So GitHub Enterprise Cloud has decided to join that approach. It's got support for it as well. And in the show notes, I dropped references to a tool from Square and a tool from Netflix. Sharkey and BLESS, that are both just open source examples of managing, an SSH CA. So I just want to throw that out there, as well as, tell listeners, go back to listen to that episode. That was a good episode, just like they all are. We also had, I think, John got to join us in that one too. So if you're missing John, go listen to episode 71.
Yeah, if you're missing John, also. But I think one of the interviews we're going to stream from Black Hat also talks about time-based limited access to service accounts and some other things. So I can't remember if we're going to do it on this show or Enterprise Security Weekly, because there were so many of them. Once we find that where that one's going to land, also really good discussion around a limited time-based type of certificates to allow access. That also minimizes your exposure for some of these activities as well.
Yeah, and I think that there was another article I put in here because I think, speaking of John, about Polaris, a new open source capability for essentially looking at Kubernetes best practices. So this is also something similar to like a kubesec.io tool. So it's good to see that there are more tools doing this and a little bit of a competition, because I think this is now maybe 4 or 5 tools that are looking at both the configuration and deployment stack, as well as a little bit more into how developers are using Kubernetes. So I think all of that is a good thing, because it seems like these different organizations are seeing that there's clearly that need, because everyone has pretty much gone all in on Kubernetes. And it's those misconfiguration mistakes that we harp on all the time. And that I think you even pulled out another article this episode about that's where things fall down.
Yeah. We've seen other tools come out, right? CIS has a benchmark now that they're working on for Kubernetes. We've seen commercial tools support aspects of these checks. But you're right. You're going to see more of these tools. This is an open source tool. It's great. It's only 20 checks, though. I think there's probably a few more that some of the commercial tools actually support. But again, you have to understand that the orchestrator is what is bringing up your containers and providing different privileges, and understanding how that's configured is really going to impact the security of your application in a container-based environment. And so you can't just think about the containers. You've got to look at the orchestrator, how it's configured. Kubernetes obviously is the one that everybody appears to be adopting after kind of Docker put a fork in Swarm a couple of years ago. But yeah, there's other tools. Some of the cloud workload protection providers have commercial checks as well. So again, it just depends on, do you already have an existing tool? Are you looking to do some basic configuration validation? There are some free options out there to help you at least make sure your Kubernetes environment's configured correctly.
Yeah, and hopefully what they're also going to compete on, these are the tools that are either part of your native cloud environment or they offer great APIs. So it's not humans that are running and going through these checks manually. These checks are just going through as part of your deployment process and either giving you that smiley face or that sad face as they detect things on a daily basis or on a per deploy basis.
Right, and
And
we're
I
going to
think
cover that in a couple articles because I brought parts of that in
yes.
as part of the integration story. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we've got a group of 3 articles that kind of all tie. That's a great segue into the idea of both what should be in that DevOps security checklist. Where are the blind spots as DevOps look at the cloud, and then we can kind of use those to talk about an example from Instagram. But yeah, as you were just talking, I think there's a DevOps security checklist talking about SAST, DAST, and IaaS. Um, but I don't think I'm going to guess that that list of just 3 items, sure, it sounds comprehensive, but that actually might not be everything that should be on a DevOps security checklist.
Yeah, I think so. When I read this article, when I saw the headline, I'm like, oh, great, a checklist to help the DevOps team understand what security tools get integrated in the pipeline and where. And then I read the article and it's focused around SAST, DAST, and IaaS, which are, look, the static analysis, dynamic testing, and the interactive stuff have been around for a while. Not that they're not valid, but there's other stuff that we've seen come into the AppSec portfolio that also needs to be integrated in. Software composition analysis. What binaries, libraries are embedded in the software that I'm using? Because it leads to the previous conversation around configuration, right? How do I check for vulnerabilities? How do I look for potential policy violations and other things in these libraries? So I don't think this is an exhaustive list. I think it's a good starting list for some of the legacy stuff that's out there. But if you're not doing software composition analysis and really understanding the inventory of stuff that you're using, looking at the different licensing requirements of these components or looking at the vulnerabilities of these different components, if you're not integrating in configuration checking as part of spinning up your infrastructure, you're missing some stuff that's not in this article. So that's why I kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit, because I don't think this is an exhaustive list at all.
I think that's a great point. And the other thing I'd add to that is that SCA is also a really easy. There's very little barrier to actually deploying that, and it's a very high both confidence and impact type of feedback you're going to get out of it. Meaning, yes, you either have this library with a known vulnerability in your dependency graph, or you don't. And there's a known vulnerability for it, so go ahead and upgrade. And fingers crossed, 9 times out of 10, the upgrade tends to be pretty easy. Whereas with SAST, we'll talk about that in a second, but SAST, DAST, and especially IAST tend to have a lot more developer effort to get them integrated well, to get them tuned, to get them working with your system. So it's like, don't necessarily, these are all good tools, but don't necessarily jump in with them as the first one, because you may be putting a lot of engineering effort that's going to take a while to pay off, where something like composition analysis or just misconfiguration checks can be really simple and get rid of those really impactful vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into SAST in a second because there's a really good article from Instagram here on static analysis. But you're right, a lot harder. IAST requires you to understand the application to really get IAST to work. Now, DAST is still a black box test, but again, it's got to be up and running somewhere in a staging environment to do the black box tests, and then all the challenges associated with that. There are some easier steps to tackle first that I think are way easier to address some of the big glaring issues we see with vulnerabilities and misconfiguration. The other thing this article talks about, which is great though, is the integration piece of this. And any security tool that you're looking at needs to be integrated back into the CI/CD pipeline. And whether it's Slack or HipChat or Jira or whatever the tool is, it doesn't matter. We've got to be able to take findings that are coming out of these tools as it's going through the pipeline and make sure they're getting back to the developers into their tool sets in a very efficient way. And there's a good section in this article that talks about that integration importance. my point was these 3 tools aren't the only 3 tools, and they may not be your first 3 tools, but the integration piece is definitely important.
Exactly. Yeah. Make sure, understand all the tools available to you. And that integration is fantastic because there's a lot of people who joke about doing Slack ops. And just like you said, it's great to have tools with APIs because then they can have a Slack bot that both does everything from just saying, hey, I finished my deploy, or I finished my scan, as well as, hey, here, I finished the scan. Here's a PR that needs to be approved to update this library from a known vulnerable version. Click here to do so. So even the Slack bots have really great, bidirectional capabilities, and you can actually, move the work to where the developers live in their IDEs and their chat, into their Jira tickets, and so on.
Yep.
So speaking of developers, let's talk about Instagram. So Instagram has a really long blog post about how they were scaling static analysis, and have to have automation for a couple of reasons. One, they have a massive monolith of Python code, and in the article, they say that they're deploying all of their commits continuously from all of their developers every 7 minutes. So this is, 100 times a day, there's a deploy going out. And just some human that is, imagine the security team that would try to be the one that's trying to manually give a thumbs up to review, code review, all of these things. That's just ridiculous and not going to happen. So you have to dive into a tool like this. And I think especially they open source this libcst, which is the concrete syntax tree, which is a nice touch. So a bit of a small tangent here. Typically, the abstract syntax tree, which is essentially taking all of the code of text, turning it into symbols to say, here are the variables, here are the functions, and so on, and then saying, this is the control flow, or this is the data flow of input going through all of these different sources into a sink being printed out to a web page. That's typically what a lot of source analysis tools work on, the AST, but they lose where comments are. They lose line number, potentially some line numbering information, and they lose some other information that is useful to humans, but isn't needed for machines that are actually executing the code. So one of the cool things that they did with this libcst, the concrete syntax tree, is they preserved all that information so that then they can not only just say, hey, let's look for some security bugs, but we're actually going to go and automatically rewrite a bunch of code. And that comes in really great when you talk about something as simple as refactoring. So they give an example where some function is deprecated and should be now called through an add function. So it's nice to have a linter that says, hey, developer, we notice you're using this old function. Please replace it with this new function. But if they're doing this throughout all of their code base, they're only going to get in front of the developers who are actually running and looking at the linter output, and probably only the developers that are touching particular areas of code. So there's all going to be, as a callback to what we just started with in this segment, you could have some component that hasn't been touched for, well, I guess Instagram isn't quite 20 years old, but maybe 5 years old. Are they 10 years old?
Maybe, yeah.
Code. But this is being able to have an automatic tool that can change the code and update those deprecation for you is actually a really compelling story, and means that humans can go and focus on the things they care about. So I just had to ramble on through that because I'm really passionate about that area, and I really love just how they took that approach to something so very simple and actually make it work at scale.
Yeah, and then open sourced it. There was a couple interesting parts in this article. One was, this is Instagram. It's a monolithic application, Python application, a little bit of C and C++, but it's basically a monolith. And everybody thinks, oh, no, they've already broken this up into containers and distribute it. No, it's one big monolith. Here's the point, guys. Every 7 minutes. Now, I always make this joke when I talk about the unification of DevOps and SecOps. Security's not used to moving this fast. Right? I always say, okay, how many people are scanning for vulnerabilities in their network every month, every week, every day. You want to talk about every 7 minutes? Think about that for a second, right? Security is not used to this frequency. So this tool is really nice because now it can automate aspects of your static analysis, to your point, maybe some rewrite of some code, but doing it in a way that allows a monolithic application to be pushed into production every 7 minutes. This is crazy scale. This is why our old existing security processes and tools don't work in this environment. And this isn't even the most dynamic, like microservice-based architecture to boot.
Absolutely. So they've had 3 deploys since we started this episode. So yeah, absolutely.
Right. Exactly
And
right.
another
Welcome, security team. Are you caught up?
Exactly. And the other thing that's there's another interesting point they make too, and it ties into a little bit of another theme when we talk about like developer education. They're talking about just because there's so many developers, they can't go and just say, hey, developer, these are the best practices. Do this, do this, do this, because there's just too many. So these auto fixers are basically a way to say, hey, check this out. I just fixed this code. Here's why it was deprecated or it had a vulnerability. Please take a look. Please, give a +1 on the pull request and double check it. But it's actually also something that is, here is a real spot in the code where there was an actual problem. So immediately it becomes relevant because it's not some theoretical, this is what the generic cross-site scripting in a boring monotone sounds like. And it's actionable because guess what? You can do something, press your +1 or whatever emoji you prefer for doing that. And great, you've helped fix code. An auto fixer did a lot of that work to find it, but you hopefully are paying attention and understanding it. And so it's a little bit more subtle and perhaps understated in all the other cool technical stuff that's going on here, but also speaks very much to you can't really scale the people angle. And that's what you were just saying. Security teams have to keep up in some way. And just telling security teams, we're going to become experts in Python and we're going to run these tools and we're going to manually review all of this data on every morning when we come into work, just isn't going to work. You have to have some other way to manage that.
Yeah, and I do like the auto-fixing capabilities of this as well, is because to your point, it's hard for developers to understand security. It's not really their core function. Their core function is, I've been given a set of business requirements, I'm coding to those, not necessarily think about security. So if you have an auto fix where it can go out, find a mistake in code and fix it for you, I mean, that's just awesome. And plus, developers over time will continue to learn through that in very specifically into what their daily job is, and they'll ultimately write better code because they see the fixes coming through. And they'll learn and they won't code it the wrong way. They'll code it the right way going forward. And maybe you have less autofix. But I think it's a really great reinforcement component for the developers to know how to write secure code.
Yeah, and I think some of it too, it's also often thankless work to go back and clean up linter warnings and things like that. But it's also not even necessarily smart way to say, hey, we're going to dedicate this small team of developers and your job is to go up and clean all these linter problems. Because one, nobody wants to do it. It is really boring. But also kind of, thinking of developers as actual human beings, nobody builds any good experience doing that. Like nobody builds experience and nobody wants to say, they want to work on new features. They want to work on putting some APIs together, deploying something new on a new cloud service, something like that. They don't want to just say on their resume, yeah, I cleaned up a whole bunch of linters and I didn't really learn much other than we're now using this function rather than that function. So even just from kind of a management perspective and working with your developer side of the team, it's just a smarter way of trying to automate a lot of that grudge work.
Yep. Great article on the 7 biggest cloud blind spots. I had to throw this article in. We covered part of it already. Number 1 was interesting. It's no longer shadow IT. It's business managed IT. The business is moving to the cloud. So security guys, hello. This isn't called shadow or rogue IT anymore. This is called the business is moving forward and they're adopting cloud. So get used to it. I thought that was an interesting number one. Number two, we've already talked about, which is cloud misconfiguration. I would have put that number one personally, because I think that's the biggest blind spot that we're definitely seeing these days is just misconfigured infrastructure, creating these breaches. To me, this is something we've got to do a better job of managing.
Yeah, absolutely. I also struck me that cloud misconfiguration should have popped up there at the top in my book as well. And yeah, I like the idea that, I think it also speaks to the security team when we go back to those ideas of security team can no longer be a gatekeeper. You're no longer the team of no, you're the team of, well, that sounds hard. Let's try to do this in a secure way. The same goes for getting rid of those terms like shadow IT, because they're not talking about people that are trying to download some BitTorrent or they want to, stream music or movies on their laptop. That may happen, but they're talking about anything that's like a Chrome browser plugin that makes certain of their workflows easier. They're talking about different chat apps, different apps being pulled into something like Slack. So we're also, part of that cloud that you're describing is also these app marketplaces, because Jira, Slack, GitHub, all these other tools and tons of them have these other bots you can pull into them. And they are exposing, your source code. Potentially, they're possibly exposing your internal resources. So security team does need to be involved and figure out how to have good constraints around it, or at least a good understanding of what are the risk trade-offs. But it's going to happen because the businesses need it and the businesses want it, and that's why they're using it. So yeah, I think the other thing that was out there too is that idea of the dark data, in the sense of, I am going to guess that PCI here is probably a good thing. So any company that's fallen under PCI, they probably actually have a pretty good understanding of where their cardholder data is, just because they've actually been forced to go through the exercise of finding it and kind of scoping it, as well as sandboxing it. But there's a lot of privacy data. There's a lot of other data. I mean, let alone credentials, that aren't necessarily being labeled. And it's a great way to have a blind spot unless you're putting a lot of effort into it. And this is where we're starting to see more organizations have this privacy engineering type of function. But once you start to get outside of Google, or depending on how much you want to roll your eyes when I say this, or Facebook, there's privacy engineering hasn't been too greatly adopted in a lot of other companies. I've seen it personally where I work. I've seen a handful of other companies, but I think it's an area where this is an engineering approach to say, what data do we have? How are we protecting it? And how can we handle it better? Whether it is things like introducing better ways to query on the metadata of what you've collected rather than the data itself, as well as, hey, let's just get rid of it, or let's delete it because it's just accruing liability.
Yeah, and I think the last one here, there's three that I think everybody's used to, right? Hybrid architectures, multi-cloud, and containerization. All interesting blind spots. We talk about those a lot. The last one on the list, though, is forensics and threat hunting telemetry. And I think telemetry in general. I think one of the biggest challenges in the cloud is kind of that visibility and control. And some of that telemetry is limiting. It also limits aspects of understanding where some of your data might be, this dark data concept as well. Yeah. I think these are tied together. Telemetry becomes a challenge, and when you add hybrid and multi-cloud into the mix, I think it only gets more complex for organizations to figure out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. If that hybrid multi-cloud part just makes that telemetry so much harder. Because you've got one tool that works in one provider, but what does it do for all the others?
Exactly. And it's solutions that have to be much more open to the concept that it's not all AWS anymore, or it's not all Azure. It is on-prem, AWS, Azure, and GCP, and every solution needs to think about those four environments at a minimum, I think, to be effective where we're seeing the market continue to move.
Yeah, and I think there is one final thing here that I wanted to throw out too. Is it's a kind of a simple high level article, just how to transition, how to become a DevOps engineer, and it has some very basic good recommendations. Learn some scripting, learn some cloud. If you're running a Mac OS system, install Brew, and that will have a lot of default tools available for you. But it also reminded me of this link about Amazon Web Services in plain English. And I can't remember when it originated from, but it's a good resource. It basically turns that
Alphabet soup.
alphabet soup. Yeah, exactly. That cuneiform / other, Greek. Who knows? Yeah, I'm trying to come up with other metaphors. Of course, drawing a blank.
All the
But
TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms.
yes, exactly. But it's really, and it's a really concise table that says, oh, this is just executing a function. This is storage. This is logging. This is redirecting logging to something else. This is encryption. So, if you're on that path to diving into the cloud or diving into DevOps, check out this Amazon Web Services in plain English, because I think it will help you understand what actually is, what you're getting into.
Yeah, but don't ignore the previous article, because I think it's a really good article. If you're more dev focused, it kind of shows you where to go. If you're more ops focused, it kind of shows you where to go. I think it's a really good article for people that are in a traditional development or operational role looking to move into this new concept of DevOps, and where's the best place for them in that new structure so that they can fine tune their skills to get there. So anybody looking, I think it's a really good article for a career move.
That's cool. And I think so. We've also, in terms of career moves, and those of you that want to find out more about the security side of DevOps, in our upcoming segment, we're going to run some interviews that Matt and team conducted at Black Hat. So we're going to dive into that, and we've got a couple announcements before then. But Matt, I don't know if you want to. Do you want to add anything about any hints about what those are coming up, or shall we roll forward?
We can pretty much roll forward. I think there's one on API security, one on mobile application security, which I think is a good one, and then the last one is on, I can't recall off the top of my head, but all three of them are really good AppSec interviews.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Matt, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll hope you stay tuned for our interviews coming up shortly. Have you been trying your hardest to get a ticket to DerbyCon finish line? We know that tickets sold out almost immediately, as they do almost every year, and we have an exciting announcement. Security Weekly is giving away 7 tickets to DerbyCon. Here's what you need to do. Subscribe to Security Weekly YouTube channel and send an email to sam@securityweekly.com. She's really nice, so send an email with either a written or video testimonial about what Security Weekly means to you. That's it. It's really that simple. First 7 people to complete this will receive a ticket to DerbyCon. You will also be invited to participate in our Security Weekly DerbyCon interview series that Sam and Mark will be running at the conference. So many of the big East Coast cybersecurity trade shows take place in crowded cities like Boston and New York, where parking is a nightmare and will cost you an arm and a leg. However, this year's Compass Cybersecurity Symposium is being held at Twin River Casino in Lincoln, Rhode Island, just 15 minutes outside of Providence. The venue has plenty of free and easy parking. Speakers include social engineering expert Chris Hadnagy and Security Weekly podcast founder Paul Asadorian. Use the discount code SW2019 to save $20 on registration. So now I want to say thanks once again to Matt. And I want to say stay with us as we share interviews from Black Hat with Ping Identity, Now Secure, and Sequence. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.